Zoom room. And if that does not work, please go into the lobby on the visual schedule. And we'll make sure we'll drop the visual schedule in the chat. And you want to click on the link labeled help. Just a reminder to our panelists, this session is being translated. So please be mindful and speak at a relaxed pace so our interpreters can translate accurately. And once again, welcome. You are currently in the panel, Challenging Establishment News Narratives, a critical media literacy perspective on gatekeeping and agenda setting by Andy Lee Roth and Mickey Huff. So I will go over short biographies before I pass it to our speakers. So first we have Andy Lee Roth, who is the Associate Director of Project Censored. He coordinates the project's Campus Affiliates Program, a news media research network of several hundred students and faculty at 24 colleges and universities across North America. In addition to co-editing the annual Censored Yearbook, his research and writing have been published in a variety of outlets, including Index on Censorship, Truth Out, In These Times, Yes Magazine, Media, Culture, and Society, and the International Journal of Press Politics. Thank you for being here, Andy.
Thank you, Raina.
Yes. And next we have Mickey Huff. He is the director of Project Censored and president of the Media Freedom Foundation. His latest books are State of the Free Press 2021, co-edited with Andy Lee Roth, and United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It, co-authored with Nolan Higdon. He is professor of social science, history, and journalism at Diablo Valley College, where he chairs the journalism department and is the executive producer and host of the syndicated weekly public affairs program, The Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. Big welcome, Mickey.
Honored to be here, Raina. Thanks so much. And thanks to all the conference organizers and everybody that came out to this session today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yes. And with that being said, I will pass the torch.
Thank you, Raina. It's a real honor to have you moderating our session this morning. Thanks also to Andrea Gambino down south on the UCLA campus and the whole team of people that have made this event possible. As Mickey said, we're grateful and honored to be involved and part of this. What we're about to present is very much work in progress. And so what Mickey and I will try to do here today is talk about, under the rubric of challenging establishment news narratives, what we've been working on the past several months has been an effort to kind of make sense of and understand the flow of news and other forms of information. This is for us very much a work in progress. And so we're going to try to limit our remarks to about 30 minutes or so, with the idea that we want to have a great dialogue, partly because that's, I think, the nature of an event honoring Paulo Freire. It's not a filling containers kind of operation, but also more selfishly because Mickey and I want to glean from the collective wisdom in this virtual room as we continue to work on refining the model that we're trying to develop here. So without further ado, let me kind of orient you to what we've been thinking about in preparation for this conference. In 1710, Jonathan Swift, the British social commentator noted, falsehoods fly and truth comes limping after it. And that quotation in some sense kind of frames what Mickey and I are interested in trying to make sense of. How does information circulate? Why does falsehood fly? What gives it wings, right, to extend that metaphor? And why does the truth come limping behind? What is it that hamstrings the truth or disables it? These questions have been, I think, prominent ones for anyone interested in critical media literacy for a long time, right? Going back to basics. But they've become part of a wider public discourse, at least since the rise of Donald Trump as president of the United States, and perhaps even more pointedly since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization, and I'll try to be a fancy presenter here and share my screen just for a moment. The World Health Organization has referred to the current pandemic as being both a health pandemic, but also an informational infodemic. And so if I'm successfully sharing my screen now, you can see one image that the World Health Organization has produced about the spread of misinformation and how misinformation either circulates further or is stopped in its tracks by people engaging in various forms of what we might think of as critical media literacy. I'll put a link up for that World Health Organization image in a moment. So our presentation, this work in progress, as I'm talking about, is aiming to try to identify systematically some of the factors that explain the spread of both trustworthy news and information, but also its counterpart, misinformation and disinformation. And here we're inspired by one of the many insights from Paulo Freire's classic Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire's observation that reality is better thought of as a process than as a static entity. And so if we're talking about trustworthy news, if we're talking about disinformation or misinformation, then we really are talking about processes, media processes, social processes that we can unpack and open up. And as we understand them, we become better armed, better prepared to recognize misinformation and disinformation and to call it out when we see it and recognize it. And hopefully, not necessarily to take exactly the same line that the World Health Organization has taken, to be better able to stop misinformation and disinformation in its tracks at those various nodes where they can either be, where that information, that content can either be pushed on to more and more members of the public or stopped. So that's our project. I'm going to pass the baton over to Mickey now, who's going to start by talking about some of the factors that accelerate the spread of disinformation or misinformation. So Mickey.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for framing our discussion and conversation today. Definitely looking forward to hearing from the folks that are here today in this session. Factors that accelerate the spread of mis and disinformation, just very clearly at the outset. Misinformation, as we know, is information that is spread that is erroneous or faulty, but those spreading it are not aware. It's unintentional. Disinformation is the purposeful spreading of information known to be false or dubious or suspect. And so both, of course, have negative results on the public in general. And so the one thing that we look at, of course, that accelerates the spread of mis and disinformation is the hegemonic control of information dissemination systems. predominantly in places like the United States, it's dominated by a half a dozen corporations, right? And so that's very problematic. And that's legacy media. We also now have a handful of very high-powered, influential sort of tentacles in all facets of our economy, society, politics, and that's the big tech sector, right? The alphabets that own the Googles and the YouTubes and the Facebook that owns the Instagrams. Notice how they've adopted the same policies, right? Both horizontal and vertical integration, kind of creating these oligopolies, if you will. Well, that's one of the big problems, because who's checking on those sources, right? And those sources, and we're going to get to this later, those sources often have internal sort of checks on information, whether it's the former ombudspersons of the legacy media or editors. In big tech, they have, recently, you've heard about the Facebook integrity team. We'll get into that later too, that was disbanded after the last election. And then there's also third-party fact checkers. We're going to get into these things in more detail as we go on. But let's remember that all of that tends to take place sort of under that umbrella of myopic corporate ownership of media. And that's not regulated by the First Amendment. And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a battle between the legacy media and First Amendment applications and government regulations and this new social media, digital media. So we're into new frontiers, well on our way. And there are many challenges with that. And as Andy showed on that infographic that I linked into the chat room, we want to make sure that we try to strengthen the flow of truthful and factual information while slowing down the mis and disinformation without relying on censorship or blocking out voices. And that's what critical media literacy education is all about. And of course, you can see, I'm giving a spoiler alert here, of course, where we're going with our conversation today is that this is why we need critical media literacy education. That's one of the main bulwarks against this kind of myopic ownership. Now, look, it's not just corporate ownership of media that's the problem. It's the corporate control over the economy and over our information systems in general, right? And through the corporate media, we don't just have corporate ownership, we also have corporate advertising. Of course, people here are likely familiar with Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky's propaganda model over 30 years ago that talks about the problems and influences of ownership, advertising, sourcing, or newsmakers and shapers that we'll talk about later, flack, boycotting, feedback, and then ideology. There are more updated for the 21st century. Christian Fuchs, Rob Williams talked about those. Again, those will come up here in a little bit. But I did want to share at least two stories that Project Censored covered very briefly that talk about the pernicious influence of corporations over information and the chilling effect they have that stops the flow of accurate information in place of false or faulty or misleading public relations, chief among them Monsanto. One of our top stories this past year, you can see it at projectcensored.org, is Monsanto Intelligence Center targeted journalists and activists. So just very quickly, I want to just read a quick quote here to distill the message without getting into the details. Journalist Sam Levin reported in The Guardian that Monsanto, quote, adopted a multi-pronged strategy to target a Reuters journalist who had reported on the likelihood of Monsanto's Roundup weed killer causing cancer. Right. So the short of this is that Monsanto basically created this intelligence center to both track and then harass and try to silence reporters that are trying to expose the corruption of these companies and the public health risks to the public. Right. This is kind of an old, age-old story, but corporations have definitely upped the ante, so to speak, whether it's in lobbying and through ALEC-like legislation, American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act to discourage these kinds of protests, or literally going after and shooting the messenger, so to speak, right? The other is, of course, a shadow network of conservative outlets that emerged to exploit faith in local news. This was reported in Columbia Journalism Review, as well as a story that was broken by the Lansing State Journal. So here we see different types of media breaking these stories. This was story number 6 in our most recent book. And it shows, and again, just very, very quickly here, This story highlighted how a network of 450 websites operated by only 5 corporate organizations in 5 states mimicked the appearance and output of traditional news organizations in order to manipulate public opinion by exploiting faith in local media. These are real stories and challenges. And this also goes to something that we're going to get into in a little bit that talks about the news desert, local news deserts, right? And why this is so troublesome and problematic for the public in general is that those voids are being filled. Well, we need to ask what they're being filled with, right? And in this case, this is another kind of story about how we have more nefarious forces, corporate forces behind the scenes making an attempt to influence public opinion. So I'm going to speed through the next couple of parts here because we want to get through factors that also accelerate the spread of trustworthy information, right? Not just all negative, right? All on the negative front. One of the issues, of course, that we've been, and this infodemic graphic that Andy and I had shared, there is a large public distrust in media and public institutions in general, and this has been happening for the better part of a half a century. And so what we see is that we do have real challenges with public trust, and we've talked about this in previous versions of the censored book, and I just wanted to call attention to a historian at UC Davis, Catherine Olmsted, who once noted that when citizens cannot trust their government to tell the truth, when they are convinced that public officials routinely conspire, lie, and conceal their crimes, they become less likely to trust the government to do anything. The result is a profoundly weakened polity with fewer citizens voting and more problems left unaddressed for future generation that's ever more cynical about the possibility of reforms. Well, we could easily argue that this extends not only to government, but other major public institutions, including the so-called free press. And so we are, in the last couple of years, we've been awash in sort of a conspiracy culture in a lot of ways. And this is, again, this contributes to how people have a hard time discerning between fact and fiction. Back to the Jonathan Swift quote, right? A lot of this has to do with our cognitive and implicit biases and why we rely on these more heavily when we further distrust the systems of information dissemination. Again, critical media literacy information goes a long way to be an antidote against this. And if that's not enough, government secrecy and a decline of public trust in government institutions and the media, that's also been manifest on massive attacks against journalists and journalism in general. From Donald Trump's attack on the press as the enemy of the people, riffing off of the Germans' Lügenpresse from World War I and II, the lying press, through, going back, you can go back to Nixon, the nattering nabobs of negativism, the general negative frame around the press, right? And the Trump administration's reliance on alternative facts and these types of things. But it's not just attack on the institutions, it's literally a serious uptick in attack of actual journalists, was massively on display with the George Floyd protests, literally hundreds, nearly 1,000 attacks on journalists. This is very, very problematic. So we've got a lot of challenges, right? There's a lot of challenges out there in our society of people jockeying for placement to try to get information to the public, but we're left with the questions of, well, whom do we trust? So factors that actually then may accelerate that information are what we're going to tackle next. Andy might want to come in and talk a little bit more briefly about the importance of organizations like the US Press Freedom Tracker. These are the reasons why we know how many attacks have been on journalists, is that there are really great organizations that are really trying to help us understand the challenges we face. And then after that, we want to talk about these factors that will accelerate the spread of trustworthy information. So Andy, back to you.
Yeah. So if you go back and imagine for a moment now that that diagram, that World Health diagram that we showed earlier, showing how information either moves forward or is halted at a node, a kind of a intersection checkpoint. Some of the factors, to kind of summarize Mickey's point, some of the factors that accelerate the spread of misinformation or disinformation are for us the corporate ownership of media, which entails things like, a private for-profit business orientation, the demise of local news, algorithmic gatekeeping by big media organizations that don't necessarily even think of themselves as being journalists, but are nonetheless involved in perpetuating the spread of information presented as news. And then, as Mickey mentioned, and these are, I'm reiterating these here because they all would be topics for potential conversation when we shift to that part of the panel today. Also government secrecy and attacks on journalism as a profession or journalists as individual human beings in their official roles as journalists. So to shift though, we're also interested in the factors that accelerate the spread of trustworthy information. And here we have, there are 4 points that Mickey and I will together kind of go through somewhat quickly, again, with the idea of opening them up for discussion in a little bit. The first would be the existence of and public awareness of trustworthy news outlets. Now, this in some ways is like the golden key, right? If we could find it once and for all, a lot of our work, certainly the work Mickey and I do with Project Censored and a lot of the work that everyone involved in this conference is engaged in, if it was easy to find trustworthy news, a lot of our work would be unnecessary or much less necessary. But this element is complex and difficult. Much as Freire noted that we probably need to think of reality as a process rather than a static entity, I think the same is true in terms of trustworthiness. It's not a one and done fixed kind of thing. Trustworthiness is shifting and is created and recreated on a kind of moment by moment basis. Trustworthiness, as we have in our notes here, can be fickle, right? It can vary by news organization. It can vary by the topic. It can vary by the journalists and editors involved in the coverage of that topic. So a lot of times when Mickey or other people involved in Project Censored and myself talk publicly, especially with students, the question we get is like, well, what news outlets do you trust, right? And that's never a simple question to answer. But it is simple and straightforward to say that the more we have and people are aware of trustworthy news outlets, the better we are able to fight the spread of misinformation and disinformation. So there's a point of clarity there that I want to emphasize, even as I'm talking about now about some of the complexity and difficulty around that point. One example that Mickey and I were talking about some as we thought about this idea of trustworthiness as a process. One example would be The Guardian. And I won't go into extreme detail here, but there's a fantastic chapter in Alan MacLeod's book, Propaganda in the Information Age, a chapter by Matt Kennard on The Guardian. And we mentioned this not necessarily in order to pick on The Guardian. In fact, almost every year for the last handful of years, the Project Censored Top 25 story list has included stories sourced from The Guardian. So clearly we're finding things of merit in that newspaper's reporting. But there are also reasons to be highly critical of The Guardian. And Mickey pointed out to me that there is quite a critical assessment of The Guardian's long-term record published by the independent news outlet Media Lens, which is a UK-based kind of media watchdog operation. Media Lens, L-E-N-S, like the lens of a camera. So trustworthy news organizations would be one major factor that accelerate this spread of trustworthy news and information. The The second of these I'll turn over to Mickey to talk some about would be the idea that's been floated here in the US, especially since the pandemic began, of public funding for journalism. Mickey.
Thanks, Andy. One of the factors that could accelerate the spread of trustworthy information is having an actual public system in place that was truly funded and supported in a public interest manner. And I say that as sort of a backwards way of critiquing, the so-called public media that we have in the United States, whether it's public broadcasting, PBS, NPR. A lot of it is actually funded by what they call underwriters, which is just a way to get around saying they're not accepting advertising in a lot of ways. But most of this money that funds so-called public media isn't really public. And if you go and look at what NPR and PBS do on a regular basis, or in Britain, the BBC, it's not always really in the public interest, and it has many of the same hallmarks of propaganda and bias that we see in establishment and legacy media. So some of the things that we've covered over the years, have really highlighted solutions about, well, what do we do to create a better public media system? And I'll post here in the chat in a moment. Our story 10 this past year was Victor Pickard, the media scholar from University of Pennsylvania, and also Craig Aaron of Free Press. Both of them have strongly advocated over the years, including during the pandemic, that what we need is a robustly funded public media system, right? In the early stages of the pandemic, when we were seeing talk about bailouts, right? And we were seeing talk about stimulus packages, Pickard and Aaron jumped on that right away to say, well, we've already been in the midst of an information crisis, of a crisis in journalism, more and more corporations owning, fewer and fewer corporations owning more and more media outlets. And so one of the pushback against that trend is to have a robustly publicly funded and independent press. And while Pickard and Aaron argue that this can be begun with a few $1 billion, and I say that in the context of the US budget, right? Let's remember that the Pentagon alone, with all of its overlays and overlaps, gets nearly $1 trillion, right, annually. Let's remember that we give nearly $6 billion in various forms to the state of Israel in foreign aid. While we could be spending money here, creating an actual public information system and infrastructure. What Pickard ultimately argues is for about $30 billion, we could kick off in earnest a serious free press system that may really then be able to counter these other interests that we see in society. And again, that's just one of the things that we've seen over the years. Although we don't see much progress being made in places nationally in the US, we do see local examples of it working, right? There are examples in places like New Jersey, even in the Bay Area, there are collectives being formed, but those again are smaller and local. What people like Pickard are talking about is we need a really major institutional kind of a change here in order to counter the influence of corporate and big tech media dissemination. Now, and again, our critical media literate perspective is what leads us to these kinds of understandings. It's what leads us to understand that the system that we currently have isn't serving in the public interest. So Andy, on our outline here, we're moving along into the importance that we also play as individuals in deliberation. So it isn't just that we want to, push our responsibilities onto these other institutions and outsource our own agency, right, or our own responsibilities. So we also have an obligation to exercise critical media literacy skills, critical thinking skills, being aware of our biases and so on, so that we know how to navigate mis and disinformation, and we can be, potential roadblocks to those vectors that present or spread falsehoods. Andy, do you want to pick up there before we get into equivocal factors?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm just going to point, I'm keeping an eye on the clock and noticing we're already getting some really interesting questions. So I'm just going to say, in terms of factors that accelerate the spread of trustworthy information, I'm going to just kind of trail these out there as things that could be picked up in our discussion without going into any detail now. Mickey and I have lots of thoughts and examples to share, but like I said, we want to have time for discussion. So in addition to trustworthy news organizations and public funding, and of course the critical fundamental importance of critical media literacy, also the importance of whistleblowers in increasing the spread of important but otherwise secreted away information. Whistleblowers are in some sense the opposite side of the coin of government secrecy, one of the de-accelerators. Equivocal factors. So we, in this kind of working model that we're developing in terms of trying to understand the flow of information, we've also identified a set of equivocal factors, equivocal in the sense that they're kind of like switches on a track where depending on which way the switch is set, the train could run to this direction, to say to the left, or another direction to the right. We've identified right now in a kind of preliminary way 3 of these, 2 of which I'll mention just briefly. And again, we can come back and talk about them more as time permits. And then Mickey will talk a little more in detail about a 3rd example of these equivocal factors, these kind of switches that could either promote positive information and trustworthy information, or misinformation or disinformation. The first of these is framing. How stories are presented, kind of the window frame view through which a story is presented. And I think this is material that will be perhaps fundamental to many people already involved in critical media literacy, but we can say more about it as time permits. The other is, as Mickey mentioned earlier, the idea of who is treated as newsworthy, who do media outlets orient to as newsmakers or news shapers. But the 3rd of these, and I'll pass this back to Mickey here, he mentioned early in the onset of our talk today, is the idea of third-party fact-checking, which has been promoted as a way of dealing with so-called fake news and other forms of misinformation and disinformation. And we think of third-party fact-checking as something that, of course, in some sense, Project Censored and other similarly aligned organizations undertake. So we're involved in this, invested in this ourselves, but not everyone who's engaging in third-party fact-checking approaches it the same way. So we'll talk about this as one example in our model of how of an equivocal kind of switch or node in the flow of information. So Mickey, third-party fact-checking.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And we're mindful of the clock here, so we're going to zip through some of the rest because we definitely want to have conversation. We see some great, really great comments, questions going on in the chat, and we want to get to those. So really quickly, third-party fact-checking, of course, sounds like a great idea because it has the appearance of objectivity built right in because it says third party. That implies in a lot of ways that, oh, well, this is somebody that's not connected to the information disseminating source. This is a person or an organization that's going to help me understand this, give me things to think about. Now, look, that could all be true, but that doesn't assume that third-party fact checkers are themselves objective any more than it does that the media source itself is. And we've cataloged this for years at the project. We've talked about it on the Project Censored show. Third-party fact checkers need to be fact-checked. I know that this starts to get, rabbit hole and you get into an endless loop here, but I think it's really important to understand that when places like, Facebook and social media have third-party fact checkers, when they're hiring groups like the Atlantic Council, that's a public relations arm of NATO, that's not an objective source in any stretch of the imagination. Not that there are objective sources, but this is, again, a clear one with a clear agenda, right? A Western imperialist hegemonic agenda that's checking on factual stories. It's not just third-party fact checkers, but we're not going to have time to get into this either. But Andy wrote a great article on the problems of algorithms as, suppressing narratives or determining what is factual and what is not. One of the big examples that we saw coming during COVID-19 was the News Literacy Project's Alan Miller actually blew the whistle on the media itself this summer over the arguments about the origin of the COVID-19 strain, right? And when Trump was in office, there was great pushback by the press that any discussion of it possibly being lab related in Wuhan was a wild conspiracy theory. Facebook was taking down pages and they were suppressing sources and so on that even suggested such. Fast forward when Biden comes in, and then all of a sudden there's a total shift in the frame. And now there's an intelligence investigation. All of a sudden the corporate press says, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should look into this. This is a big example about, the power that these sources have and what can happen when we let down our guard and we assume that the ombudsman people will check, or that the algorithms will get it right, or that the fact checkers are on the side of truth. Back to Jonathan Swift, right? Again, we've got many other examples, that we could go through, but we want to conclude here quickly, and I want to go back to Andy so we can get to your all comments. What we really need here is to rely on ethical journalism and principles of the Society of Professional Journalists. We see these things going hand in hand with critical media literacy pedagogy, which means we need to seek the truth, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent in our reporting, in our scholarship, and in our interactions. And so I wanted to hand this back over to Andy, maybe to kind of take us out here so that we can talk with all of you.
Yeah. So, I think just by way of conclusion, and then I'm already itching to get to some of the comments and questions that are showing up in the chat thread, and also we can have people turn on their microphones. I think just on the idea of third-party fact checkers and corporate and state involvement, Mickey's mentioned a little, but one of the things we talk about in our introduction to the current Project Censored Yearbook, State of the Free Press 2021, is the corporate media have taken it on themselves to kind of anoint certain entities, third-party entities, as fact checkers. NewsGuard is one of these. And I think one of the things that can be very useful to do in terms of a critical media literacy pedagogy, either for oneself or if you're a teacher, to have students, to set this as a task for students to go out and explore themselves, is to look at who are the kind of experts at any of these organizations. We did that with NewsGuard, which is one of the kind of corporate appointed fact checkers. And what we found, and I'll just read from what Mickey and I wrote in the introduction, because it's probably the quickest way to make this point clear. The corporate press appears to assume that NewsGuard is a trustworthy judge of fake news because NewsGuard has partnered with major corporate entities such as Microsoft, and because its advisory board includes a number of former government officials, such as Tom Ridge, the first director of Homeland Security, and Michael Hayden, who ran the Central Intelligence Agency when George W. Bush was president. These people tidily fit, they readily fit the establishment news media's narrow standard definition of who's newsworthy, right? So it's a fox guarding the hen house kind of operation, I would say. And so, yeah, I think there's good reason to be wary of that. And again, that's the kind of thing that is with a little bit of internet access is a kind of a readily available investigative pursuit. Who are these people that are deemed the experts, right? Why does NewsGuard deserve our trust? What kind of trust are we giving them if we do give them? By way of conclusion, and I'll wrap this up very quickly, at least for the part where Mickey and I are just talking here. I think there's three conclusions that we would draw for now. One is, as Mickey mentioned, the importance of ethical journalism that is committed to the idea of seeking truth and reporting it, to minimizing harm, to acting independently, and to being accountable and transparent. These are the 4 guidelines of, in the US, the Society of Professional Journalists. We also think it's important to cultivate a public that demands and appreciates the same, right? We can have ethical journalism, but if there's no audience for it, if there's no demand for it, it doesn't matter much. And our third point links the two. The way to increase audience demand for and appreciation of investigative journalism that meets the highest journalistic standards is to promote critical media literacy. A conclusion that's probably no news to this particular group, but still bears, I think, constant, what's the right word? Still requires kind of constant championing to a broader public for whom these ideas are not well understood or not well known. And we'll not stop there, but we'll transition now to some dialogue. And we, as I said before, we welcome your thoughts, especially because this is for Mickey and me a model in development, a work in progress. Your insights will be invaluable to us. Thank you so much.
So thank you to both Andy and Mickey for such a rich conversation and providing us with so many resources. So if you haven't yet, please take a look at the chat. There are some really good links there that you can continue to explore. So we have about a little over 15 minutes to take comments, and I was recording some of the chat box before it got too crazy. We have Martha who said yesterday was Teachers' Day. That was celebrated in Brazil. So we're sending our celebrations to Brazil. If Claudia, I believe Claudia of Argentina had a comment if she wanted to speak about the 2 main corporations holding power in her country.
Thank you. Thank you all for this very enlightening talk. No, what I mean is that I've been listening to you and I've been thinking about our situation in Argentina, and well, it's exactly alike. And well, there's nothing I could add. These 2 corporations are Clarín and La Nación in my country, and they are supported by most of the business, the companies, and the interests of neoliberal politicians. And well, that's what they hold, and that's the news that they sell to us. There are other smaller media outlets, especially on the internet, run by independent journalists and organizations such as trade unions and so on. But anyway, I think that it is impossible not to be, it is impossible to be rather really objective when you publish news, because you are always defending some kind of idea, some kind of ideology. So we read what we want to read. We read what is closer to us, I believe. And that's my comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Claudia. It's wonderful to be in dialogue. And I think on your last point about objectivity, there are, I think, a number now of important studies that are empirically based that show how journalists adhering to norms of objectivity actually lead to significant news bias or news slant. And so I'm speaking personally now, not on the basis of research. To me, I agree 100% with your point about we're always approaching news, whether we're producing it or consuming it, we're always approaching news from some standpoint. And I believe the trick is not to pretend that we're disinterested or neutral or objective, but to just be clear about what our standpoint is so that other people engaging in critical thinking can assess how the points I'm making might be shaped by my standpoint, by my commitments. So I think that's a huge area, and I actually thank you very much for your question, because Mickey and I need to think more, I think, and include in our model notions of objectivity and how those relate to the flow of information, disinformation, and misinformation. Thank you.
Claudia, it's really quickly. Thanks for your comment and your. I agree 100% with what you were saying. One thing I wanted to riff on just very quickly is when you talk about how we choose what to read, and that gets into the biases, cognitive biases, implicit biases, these types of things that we also write about and teach about. But in the social media era, where in places like in the US, for example, over half of the population are now using social media for news aggregation. And those aren't journalistic sources. And even though there's an illusion of choice by I'm selecting this or selecting that, the sort of inertia of the mountain building algorithmically then tends to funnel more and more of the same kind of thing. And we may think we're clicking on something that we're getting information from, quote, both sides, but we may actually just be sort of winnowed over to a really narrow framed spectrum. As Noam Chomsky said, there can be wild debate within this narrow spectrum of accepted controversy and so on. But outside of it, there's this whole other world of information, factual information that doesn't get reported. So again, back to the issue of both needing independent press, but also needing critical media literacy skills and critical thinking skills so that we can really develop our own sense of what is right or accurate. One of the questions, comments that was in a couple of the ones in the chat, one was Ad Fontes on the media bias chart. There was another one about this very issue. So I'm happy to talk more about those too, but Raina, I'll let you sort of steer that ship.
Thank you. So Sue, I see your hand up, and so I will come to you after. There was a comment from English teacher, if who's labeled English teacher would like to speak about the media's influence on young people. If you'd like to talk.
Oh, well, it's profound. Interestingly, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, well, I think they wanted to say something.
Oh, okay, good.
English teacher, are you available? Okay, Mickey, if you wanted to make a comment.
I think absolutely. And I think the message that a lot of young people may get from older generations is that technology is maybe troublesome, or it's bad, or their use of it is problematic. And while those things can be certainly true or partially true, it's also important to understand that there are ways that the technology can be understood such that it's not using you, right? And that's a big part of critical media literacy, is understanding the influence that media, technology, everything, including the gadgets, the platforms, the applications, it's very influential. That's why I think it's even more important that we start teaching critical media literacy at a very early level, right? And one of the projects we are working on right now collectively is a book that focuses on media literacy for young people called The Media and Me. Hopefully that'll be out here in the next year or so, because I think that's an area where we're really missing. I know it's in the US, we really are. Nolan Higdon's research and his dissertation really focused on that, lack of critical media literacy education. And almost right there, not to be too essentialist, but just right there is a big enough challenge that if we really uptick that, along with another way to buttress public information, public media systems, we might go a long way at slowing down the vectors of mis and disinformation and speeding up or clearing the lanes for more factual narratives. Andy or Raina?
If that was it, I'd like to call on Sue Collins. She's had her hand up for a minute now.
Thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So thanks for the talk. I love the work of Project Censored, and I've known about it for many, many years. But I wanted to talk, and I actually asked this question in another forum, but we didn't have time to address it, so I'm going to kind of repeat it now. I live in the state of Michigan, and I teach at a STEM university. And you may recall Michigan
Sue,
our own.
Sue, if you can speak into your microphone, you're slightly muffled.
Okay, let's see if I can, is
That's
this a
better.
little better? I'm not sure what's
That
going
is
on.
better. Yes.
I'll just use my lungs. People generally tell me that I'm quiet. So I live in the state of Michigan, and you may recall that we had a mini insurrection in the state of Michigan. And so I would think, you know, that at the level of state power, their antennas should be up about this problem of mis and disinformation. And I think what I wanted to ask was, you know, it seems to me that we've been having this conversation for a long time, and I don't disagree with any of the points that are being made. But the one thing I want to ask about is a deeper kind of approach that deals with maybe the legislative, because it seems to me, and this is based on some really great recent work by historians like Nicole Hemmer's Messengers of the Right, or Nancy McLean's Democracy and Change, where they're in the archives and they can see how well established and planned and coordinated the right is to win its agenda, even to the point of, you know, educating judges and winning over judges, like in this sort of really thick level. And I don't know that media literacy educators are working at the level of state power through the lobby. So, for example, you know, when I was in college in California, we had to take critical thinking. It was required. It is not a required course at my campus. And in fact, we're asked to like somehow slip it in, you know, some, you know, units with these ridiculous rubrics for trying to measure it. It's ridiculous. But we need it.
Sue, we want to grasp everything you're saying, but we are having a hard time. You're cutting in and out. If you could.
Oh, I don't know what's going on. Let me turn off my camera.
Okay.
See if that helps a little bit. So I'm asking about the extent to which media literacy education tries to organize at the level of state power for legislative changes. That is to say, it would be much easier if people were exposed to these kinds of things that weren't just our students, our majors, right, teaching to the choir, but rather general education kinds of curriculum. And so, are we doing anything? It hasn't been done. What can be done to sort of address that approach to instilling the importance of media literacy? And I'm talking about at the level of university, but I'm also interested in secondary education.
So, Sue, from what I gathered, a lot of great points in there. I'm sorry I didn't hear all of it, but I think I can put the pieces together. I mentioned ALEC earlier, the American Legislative Exchange Council. I mentioned the Monsanto Intelligence Centers. And look, this is only scratching the surface, as you likely well know. And Nolan and I wrote about this in United States of Distraction, citing Nancy McLean, you know, going back to the 50s, going back to early stages of right-wing think tanks, going back to the Lewis Powell memo of 1971 in the Nixon years. You know, there was a concerted, planned effort after the 60s to shut down people's movements, bottom-up movements for social justice that expanded civil rights.
Yes.
Period. I mean, it was blatant. The whole Nixonian war on drugs was a ruse to throw Black people in prison. I mean, it's on the tapes. You can hear them saying it. And this is something I think that maybe some media scholars pay less attention to. But since I'm also an historian, and Andy is, a sociologist, for us, all these things kind of converge. And the history of the development of these challenges, to me, is so significant. Because if you don't understand the forces you're up against and their very long roots, you sort of just end up picking off the branches, right? And then as soon as you pick off the one branch, boom, another one comes up. Boom, diabolical roots indeed. So I think critical media literacy education has the power to merge interdisciplinary forces to really call out and expose this. Yeah, corporate media literacy is one thing Nolan is writing to me. We need to understand who these groups are, why they want to have the narratives they do, and why they censor other types of stories. That's a really big part of it. Now, lobbying, you say, there are efforts. Joel Siegel and others are now working to create an inverse ALEC called Smart ALEC, which is a way to get into these state legislatures people's legislation, real legislation that might be able to counter these mega corporate oppressive forces that people like Lewis Powell were writing about 50 years ago, demanding that chambers of commerce really take back over the public sphere. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Sue, and I think that we'd all be mindful to sort of broaden and lengthen in many ways the ways in which we think about critical media literacy and how we teach it in historical context. Andy?
I think a really important organization in that regard, especially for college and university campuses, is the organization Uncoke My Campus. I'll put a link up here.
Thank you. So we have some really good comments.
That's a good
We
one.
probably have time to call on a couple more folks, but want to call out a comment that Andrea made. She said the existence and public awareness of trustworthy news outlets is a key component, especially to bridging critical media literacy and practitioner spaces like K-12, higher education, and community learning spaces. We also have Sabrina, who wanted to know your thoughts on ad fontes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so ad fontes, just very quickly, ad fontes, the idea from the Latin back to the source, which I think, at least here in the United States context, is being used more and more to refer to people who are interpreting news in terms of the Bible. And there is fascinating research by the sociologist Francesca Tripodi. I actually put that link back in the chat a little ways ago. A study by Francesca Tripodi called Searching for Alternative Facts about, Francesca Tripodi did a detailed empirical study with conservative news consumers, especially conservative news consumers who are Christian, analyzing the news in terms of biblical scripture. I recommend that study to anyone who's interested in that topic, or anyone who's interested in kind of a fascinating empirical study about how people interpret and make sense of news. One of the key points of Tripodi's study that I think is relevant here is she takes as a starting point that there is a genuine interest, there is a commitment in some sense among the people she studied to trying to make sense of the news in a critical way. But the critical lenses that they're using are very different. And one of her key findings, not to give away the whole show, the article is worth reading, is that, again, the role of these big tech search engines, which people are using to fact check the stories, is a problematic role, because the Google search engine is not a neutral medium. It is the result of algorithms that have been created by humans, and it has baked into it some of those very human biases. So Tripodi's study is fascinating. I'll put the link up again so it's a little more fresh in the in the chat, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested in these issues.
Thank you. So for the fidelity of our schedule and time, try to keep true to that. Andy or Mickey, did you have a 30-second conclusion, wrap up, or drop of information you'd like to add to the chat?
I'm putting more things in the chat now. I would just like to end by thanking all the organizers and everybody that came here from in this entire North and South Hemisphere, right? Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, second annual. This is an ambitious but much needed effort and conference. We're honored to be affiliated and supporters and sponsors of the event. And I think that, when we collate a lot of this information and the stuff we get from this weekend, it's really encouraging to me as an educator that I have new sources, new information, new perspectives to go. So this is just a treasure trove for me. So again, thanks to Nolan, Raina, Jeff Scher, Allison Butler, everybody involved here. It's just an honor to be here, and we thank you. I posted a couple of new things in the chat over here, including a couple sources people may be unfamiliar with: Improve the News, Biaspedia. I'm also going to put my email there so that anybody that wants to get in touch with us or work with us at Project Censored, we're very open source and very collaborative. we'd love to hear from you. Andy?
I second everything that Mickey said. I'm putting my email address in the chat too. And then on the program tomorrow at 12:15 is a panel with other Project Censored affiliated scholars about the project's Campus Affiliates program, which currently has about 24 college and university campus members from across North America. But we would love to see that program extend and grow beyond the northern part of the continent. So if you are available tomorrow around 12:15 Pacific time, please join us then. Thanks so much for today. I'm thrilled with the dialogue we had, and one of our goals, as I said at the outset, was to come away with some new insights, and you all have given us those. So thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. And thank you, Raina, for managing our affairs for the hour.
Yeah, thank you, Raina.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful conference.
Thanks, everybody.